All guests on ZASLOW Show 2.0 brought to us by the official beer of the program. You know, I'm talking about Johnny Cuba, European roots with that Caribbean soul, a refreshing German lager in a can. Pick up a six-pack of Johnny Cuba for the weekend. How else are you going to enjoy the Dolphins preseason opener tomorrow night? Remember to always drink responsibly, and don't forget Johnny Cuba's mantra, stay tranquilo. Joining us now is our pal Travis Wingfield, Dolphins Drive Time Podcast, pre and post, Dolphins Radio Network. Travis, good to see you. We're here tomorrow night. We got some real football for the Dolphins. How are you, pal?
Yeah, I was going to say it's football season now because I'm talking to you, Zaslow. That's how I know it's time to talk about an actual Dolphins game and not off-season moves and joint practices and all the stuff that happens out here that's kind of filler before we get to actual football. And it's not actual football, but it's the closest thing we get. So I'm fired up, man. Can't wait for it and doing very good.
Now, this is, I think, maybe the third or fourth year that there's only 3 preseason games as opposed to 4. And we always knew what the protocol was, where the third game is dress rehearsal and the second game, the starters will play a little bit more than the first game. Do we have like a definitive way that teams handle the 3 preseason game schedule? Or is it really just about each team does their own thing?
Yeah, the latter. I did a podcast that's coming out later this afternoon as well. Taking a look at which matchups I think are going to be best for the game tomorrow night. And I was trying to decipher who I think we'll see from the Falcons. And I went back and looked at Raheem Morris when he was a head coach previously. And I don't think it's informative at all because so much has changed. And you look at some teams don't play anybody ever. I don't think Jared Goff has taken a preseason snap in like 3 years. So like some teams don't do it at all. But for the Dolphins, I think they've under McDaniel for 2 years have sort of developed a routine, if you will, which is not a lot of guys play in the game. You know, the first one, you get a pretty good dress rehearsal in the second game, and then a bit of a tune-up, a series or 2 for the main guys in that final game. Is that the track they take this year? I know McDaniel's very, he's very intent on following what he believes to be a day-by-day evaluation, which doesn't shortchange the future days by, planning ahead because he thinks that it takes away from the value of those practices and all the work you have. But if we're going off precedent, that's kind of the track that he has followed, which is his move, right? It's not necessarily a routine across the National Football League. So I guess that makes it fun that we don't know what we're going to get. But for the Dolphins, they've done the same thing for the most part the last 2 years.
So year 3 for Mike McDaniel, what have you noticed as far as differences in training camp this year than in the past?
I'm glad you asked that because I've been on this, I don't want to call it a tirade, but I'm really trying to explain like the value of training camp practices on my show lately. And I think one thing we've seen is they know who they are, right? They know the bread and butter they have in this offense. They know when they need an 18-yard dig from Tua to Tyreek, they can probably call upon that. They know when they can run that little mesh concept, the RPO with the rail up the sideline, the seam route, and Tua has the swing option. Those are bread and butter plays that they run a lot, and they can count on those when they need them. What I think I've seen this year is kind of the expansion of how the offense can evolve off of the bread and butter, off of the stuff they do well. So I think that there's been kind of a really big emphasis on trying to just expand the offense and become more indefensible across the entire field with more weapons at Tua's arsenal. And I think we've seen them really harp on that, and it's caused some up and down performances in terms of the result. But I don't care about training camp results, Zaslow. I never have. I want to see a team that knows who they are and what they can do well, and then let's go ahead and build upon that and try to progress so that come September 8th against the Jaguars, they have their full complement of what their offense can be this season.
What have you noticed differently on the defensive side? Obviously, new defensive coordinator. Seems like the players are really pleased with that whole scenario.
Yeah, they love Coach Weave. They love the defensive coaching staff. Ryan Crow, the new outside linebackers coach, keeps getting rave reviews. Obviously, Austin Clark back again to do his thing up front. Aggression, different types of blitz and pressure looks and simulated pressure looks where they can get various guys that come from different spots. DBs come, linebackers come, edges drop. It's a fun mix of kind of a hint more towards what we saw in the previous Dolphins defensive iterations under like Flores and Boyer, just in terms of being more in tune to trying to get the quarterback off of his spot, opposed to playing, 4-man rush, just play coverage and disguise our coverages that way from the kind of the Fangio defense a year ago. So just really playing with your hair on fire and getting upfield. And they drafted guys, they signed guys that fit that mantra too. Like this rush group, I don't think I've ever seen a Dolphins team that has more like quick get off. I mean, you go back to like Cam Wake, obviously was a unicorn in that regard, but between Chop, between Kamara, the guys that are on the PUP, JP and B Chubb, like there is so much first step quickness. I think it really changes the way you have to pass protect against this Dolphins front. And I think that the defensive system really caters to that speed.
All right, let's talk about some of those guys there. Chop Robinson, tell me what he's looked like. Tell me what he's good at so far. How much do we think he could contribute early in the season?
I made this comparison, and comparison is the thief of joy, right? But I don't know exactly what his role will be all year long. I think there's some work to do in terms of, getting off blocks, and he has to learn how to rush tackles for the course of an entire game, because at this level, those guys are so talented at understanding like how to, show one move and bluff one move, one rep, and come back to something else later in the game. So he has to learn how to, put together an entire rush package throughout the course of a game. But just on pure athletic ability, it kind of reminds me of Aldon Smith, his first year with the Niners, when he was like the third rusher, kind of like, that meme of the guy that drops is it a lobster into the pot and it explodes? And he's like, oh no, like that's kind of what it reminds me of. He is just an absolute hair on fire, absolute Tasmanian devil the offensive line is going to have to deal with. And the best part about it is I think he can be as effective, tightening the edge with his speed rush off the corner, but also rushing inside where he can mix up the pass protection scheme from the interior and create one-on-ones outside for guys like JP and guys like Chubb when they get healthy and back. So he's been as advertised. That speed, man, it is real.
Travis, I think that, there was a lot to made about the defense in the offseason, guys that they lost, Christian Wilkins, Van Ginkel, even Xavier Howard, who is still looking for a team. But I think this defense is going to be better this year. I mean, it's hard to replace Christian Wilkins, although it may just mean more playing time for Zach Sealer, I guess. But he's a defensive tackle. I don't necessarily want to spend all that money on a defensive tackle. And I look at the secondary, adding Fuller, Jordan Poyer. I think this defense could be better than it was last year.
Those guys, the guys you mentioned there with Fuller and Poyer, the versatility and leadership alone that they bring is it's not really tangible, but you can see the impact out here just with how they communicate and how they cover on that back end. But to your point, this is something I talk about in the podcast. Like if you want to see what matters to a team, just follow the money. That the money will tell you where they put their resources at, and it's edge, it's cornerback, like you mentioned, it's offensive tackle, quarterback, receiver. These are the premier positions in the National Football League. And I won't discredit what Christian Wilkins did for this team because he's a great football player. He's going to be great for the Raiders. He's going to make Max Crosby even better. They got an absolute home run of a player in Christian Wilkins. But to your point, Calais Campbell's pretty damn good, man. He's in his 17th year, and last year he was just as good as he was in his 8th year. He is still very effective. Tier Tart is a guy that has that same quickness and really good pass rush arsenal. Benito Jones is a very good nose tackle for 15, 20 snaps a game where he can just eat up blocks and play the run. But Jonathan Harris has had a good camp so far from Denver. Neville Gallimore is a guy that I think didn't get utilized correctly in Dallas and has a chance to kind of break out here. You mentioned Zach Sealer, like he had 10 sacks last year. He had 23 quarterback hits. Like this is one of the best defensive tackles in the National Football League. Calais Campbell's a plus starter. And then you have a bunch of guys that can, fill out roles and play rotation. I'm with you. I think it's going to be a very good defense. And we didn't talk about the linebackers yet. Jordan Brooks, you talk about the real deal. Jordan Brooks is that. Anthony Walker, when he was healthy and playing early in camp, was making an impact. David Long's a really good player. Duke Riley's had a good camp. Zeke Vandenberg looks like might be a special teams contributor right away. Like it's deep, man. It's a lot deeper this year than it has been in the past, and that's what gets me excited.
So Jalen Phillips, Bradley Chubb, PUP, what does all of that mean at the moment?
So it just means that if they were to go into the season on PUP to kick things off, they would be out for the first 4 games of the season. Now, we've seen JP just absolutely getting after it in his, off to the side work and, change of direction and sprinting. To me, he looks close. I don't know what that timeline is for him, but he looks really close. Bradley Chubb is, he's one of the guys that also attacks this thing as hard as anybody you can, possibly imagine. I haven't seen him do like as much in terms of the off to the side work, I should say. But I think that, I don't think it's going to be too long for either of those guys. I don't know the exact timeline, but the good news is the guys behind them have been getting valuable reps. We talked about Chop. We talked about Mohamed Kamara. I think Kamara might be a hit as well. Quentin Bell is a guy that came kind of from out of nowhere, and he's been awesome from day one. So I'm really excited to see how this group comes together. But it's whenever those guys get back, it's just going to be a shot in the arm to a defense that has played pretty good so far in camp.
So you don't expect a ton of the starters to play tomorrow night?
Just based on precedent, yeah, I would say it's probably going to be, game 2. We see most of those guys, but you never know. McDaniel wouldn't commit to it, so I'm not going to commit to it.
You know what? I think it's a really cool thing with the organization, and I've talked about a lot actually this offseason on the show, is that I got to give this Dolphins front office a lot of credit in regards to just the way that they do business. Like the Jalen Waddle contract kind of popped up out of nowhere. We didn't even really know that they were, even going back and forth. And then you had all the reports when Tua was holding in. You had all the reports, they're far apart. There's not really any movement. I'm like, I don't think that's accurate. I think the fact that he's there in camp and he's actually holding in, I think it means they are close. And then the next thing you know, that deal was signed. Nothing was negotiated through the media. And then the Tyreek Hill stuff. We didn't know that they were negotiating. I mean, Tyreek had mentioned that he'd like a new contract, but the most important thing is winning a Super Bowl, not me getting money. And then just out of nowhere, they signed, didn't sign, but they rearranged the money for Tyreek Hill over these next 3 years. Like, they kind of move in the dark, this Dolphins front office, and they don't allow any of this stuff to get into the media. It's very impressive.
Yeah, moving in the dark is a perfect way to describe it, because that's kind of where my brain was going as you were speaking there. And how fitting is that for a guy like Chris Grier, who wants to operate behind the scenes, doesn't want the spotlight, doesn't want credit, doesn't want to be, associated with. Chris Grier built this powerhouse roster that has 8 of the top 100 players in the NFL, which, by the way, is the second most behind only last year's Super Bowl runner-up in the 49ers. So a pretty good roster they put together here. And I'm with you, man. And the Wilkins and Hunt departures, it hurts on the bottom line for this year, because that's a really good right guard and a really good defensive tackle that were very productive players here for a long, long time. But to your point, there is foresight for down the road. There was foresight for the Tua contract, for the Waddle contract. What made this team click and go? It's the passing offense, right? So let's get that stuff taken care of. And then next, we talked about Ramsey. He was a guy they brought in last year. The pass rush, Phillips's contract is coming up. He's a guy that you have to imagine is a priority because of everything that he offers, not just on the field, but off the field as well. I think that they've shown you where their priorities lie, and it's the positions that typically, traditionally have had the biggest impact on the win-loss column. And that's, what more can you ask for than that?
Have you seen Tua, the mobility on display at all here in training camp? One of my favorite things about Tua is he really seems to tackle in the offseason something that he is previously not good at, and then tries to improve upon that going into this season. And I think it's pretty clear with him dropping the weight, he knows he needs to have the mobility. My biggest knock on Tua is I don't see enough of the magical plays where you're extending the play, you're rolling out of the pocket, and maybe part of picking up yardage on third down, for a first down. You run the ball yourself. And I feel like him dropping the weight is him acknowledging that he needs to be able to add that to his game.
Yeah, because if he can create, 1 or 2 more plays that was a negative and turn into a positive in games, that's all he needs to do for that to be an effective part of his game, right? And I'm with you, because last year you talked about adding the weight. It was determined, from him and his own training staff and decision makers and the Dolphins here, the coaching staff, that the element that kept him healthy was how he took hits and how he fell. Because you go back to the injuries, they were all because he was just kind of falling awkwardly or getting body slammed to the ground and hitting his head on the turf. And so he kind of learned how to mitigate that and realize like I can do that and still have the, slimmed down frame and be a little quicker. And I think it's been tangible out here at practice. He has this little move where he like hits the top of his drop, and he's so quick with how it's bang, bang, ball out, and we're going on to the next play. But he has this little move. It reminds me of Tuscaloosa Tua, they used to call him, right? Where he hits the top of the drop and like he resets and kind of puts the ball up over his head and gets, vertical or attacks the line of scrimmage, and then gets horizontal and kind of extends the play as a passer more so than a running threat. And he's made a handful of plays doing that so far in training camp. And it's so weird to me because mentioning Alabama Tua, that's who he was, ZASLOW. Like, that's why we loved him. That's why he was this guy that teams were lining up to try to draft number 1 overall back going into that final year at Alabama, because he was so accurate. He was so quick with the football, but he created all the time and made free rushers miss all the time. And then the hip injury happens. And then he has the added weight last year. Like, he's fluctuated between this aspect of his game for the mobility and create the creation that you talk about. And I think that now, like a point of emphasis this offseason, to your point about how every year he finds something to get better at, that was clearly a focus of his. And to me, at these practices, it's tangible. You can see it.
And how is the team handling Odell Beckham right now?
He's been out there running, man. And he looks pretty quick. He's been doing full field sprints up and down here at practice. And the other day he was doing some lateral stuff with the trainer. So I don't know the timeline. I wish I did for you, but he's out here working. To me, he looks close, but what the hell do I know?
So do he and Tua, like, maybe you don't see it, do they work together, separately? Like, how do they create a rapport then right now?
No, there hasn't been any of that so far, just because the guys that are, coming back from injuries don't get involved in that portion. If you dress for practice at all and you go through individuals, like, that's a different part of practice than if you're just working off to the side. Like, Cam Smith came back from something that was nagging him early on in camp, and he came back and did a couple of days of individual drills first and then didn't participate in team drills. So it's basically, if you're not part of that group of the team portion of practice, you're not going to get reps there with the guys, the quarterbacks.
Gotcha. So tomorrow night, Dolphins, Falcons. We got some real Dolphin football to watch. Travis, of course, we want to be able to listen to you before, after the game. Tell everybody all the ways that we can hear you and your pals. Yeah,
we'll have a segment on the pregame show with Goldie and Juice. That's on Big 105.9 FM, I believe. And then also on Fox Sports 940 AM. You can find us in the postgame show. That's me, OJ, and Seth breaking everything down. And late into the evening, early morning hours on that show. So catch us there on the same stations, 940 and 105.9. Of course, Drive Time Podcast will have the recap, and that's just my analysis of the game, which will drop early morning hours on Saturday, wherever you get your podcasts.
Excellent job as always, Travis. Thank you, pal. We'll do this again right before the season starts. Get everybody prepared for week number 1.
Looking forward to it, man. Thanks a lot.